Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little odd and very, very quiet. Dim the lights, get comfortable, find that perfect blanket temperature that only exists for 7 minutes and then mysteriously disappears. We're going to drift through a corner of European history that lived on the edges of town and on the edges of respectability. No battles. No thrilling twists, just slow, steady lives shaped by a job no one wanted and yet many inherited. The executioner's family. Breathe in. Exhale. We're not here to judge them. We're here to watch them from a safe distance, like you'd watch a candle burn down on a rainy evening. The flicker is steady. The wax puddles. Time slides. And in that soft light, we'll meet the people who stood between law and death, and somehow made a living out of it, generation after generation. Let's start with the simple truth that can float in your mind like a leaf on water. Execution was a job, not a legend, not a monster under the bed. A job with a schedule, fees, tools to maintain, and craft standards to uphold. And like every tedious job, it came with paperwork, receipts, permits, complaints about pay, and families who had to eat dinner at the end of the day, whether the town adored them or not. Spoiler, the town did not. Across late medieval and early modern Europe, many cities hired a permanent executioner. The title varied: the hangman, the headsman, the master of high justice. Each title sounded lofty, because of course it did. Nothing says, "Please don't talk to me at church," like a ceremonial job name with the word master in it. The work included beheading, hanging, breaking on the wheel, and the occasional burning. There were floggings and brandings. There were humiliations performed in the marketplace. Someone had to do it, and somehow that someone ended up being the same families again and again. It didn't start as a proud inheritance. Often, the first executioner in a line was a man already on the margins. Sometimes a criminal who agreed to take the post in exchange for his life, or a stranger with no guild to protect him. Town councils loved that arrangement. It was efficient. One legal problem solved 2 ways. But once the post existed, it stuck to the family like a permanent stain. Sons learned the tools, daughters learned the social rules. And the rest of the town learned to look the other way, while most of them quietly booked the executioner's side hustle. Healing. Yes, healing. That's the part people always tilt their heads at. We imagine the executioner sharpening blades and glowering under a hood. In reality, he also brewed salves, set broken bones, treated infections, pulled teeth, and performed little surgeries that a respectable barber surgeon would rather not risk. It was a strange exchange. People who spat at him in daylight found their way to his door at night when their child's fever wouldn't breathe. He was dirty when you wanted a clean conscience, and clean when you needed your body saved. Convenient. Let's float over to one of the better documented lives. A Nuremberg headsman named Franz Schmidt, late 1500s to early 1600s, famous mostly because he kept a meticulous diary. He wrote down every punishment he performed, not to brag, not to horrify, just to keep the record straight. Imagine a careful, tidy man who knows exactly how many people he flogged on a Tuesday in 1598 because, well, he wrote it down. Schmidt's world was rules, techniques, and the constant negotiation of status. He lived near the edge of the city. He paid taxes. He asked permission to marry. He worried about his children's future. A normal father, if your normal father also had the keys to the city's gallows. Schmidt inherited the job after his own father was forced into it. The word forced is doing heavy lifting here. If the council said, "You will do this," you did it. You could protest, of course. But the council had the ultimate HR department. They were the law. And once a man had taken the post, a subtle, sticky web formed around his family. Respectable guilds wouldn't accept them. Many neighborhoods wouldn't rent to them. Church life got complicated. People liked their sacraments clean. So the executioner and his family found their social world shrunk down to a few streets, a familiar set of faces, and a small constellation of other outcasts, knackers, gravediggers, traveling performers, midwives with too much knowledge, and those flexible barber surgeons who would trade tips with anyone if it helped with a stubborn infection. The practical details formed a quiet rhythm. Tools were expensive. Swords for beheading were custom crafted, heavy but balanced, and had to be kept in good condition. Rope was bought and replaced. The wheel, for the grim practice of the breaking bones, had to be sturdy. Fires for branding needed fuel, and clothing, ironically, could not be too distinctive. The hood, we imagine, is mostly a later invention. In many towns, the executioner dressed plainly. You already knew who he was. He didn't need a costume. Fees were posted. Councils could be stingy. On paper, the work brought steady income. In practice, it was sporadic, and the family budget stretched or snapped based on how many punishments were ordered in a given season. Some months were quiet, mercifully sleepy. Others were clogged with petty crimes. The executioner did the humiliations, the public displays, the careful choreography that told the city, "Justice is done. The rules are real. You may go back to your bread now." Meanwhile, the domestic world kept going. Wives of executioners learned a special social dance. They were legally respectable and yet untouchable in the polite sense. Some shops wouldn't sell to them. Some neighbors wouldn't lend a bowl of butter. And yet there they were, buying wool, scrubbing steps, reminding children to keep their sleeves clean, and negotiating marriages. Marriage arrangements were the hardest puzzle. Many cities quietly encouraged executioner families to marry among themselves. It contained the stain, a word that sounds like a blot on a ledger and a little like original sin. The result was a small social archipelago of families who knew one another far too well for far too long. If that sounds like a caste system, it was a soft one. Not legal in the strict sense, but real enough that you could feel it when you walked into a tavern and conversations paused. The family names traveled across borders. A few famous dynasties in France, in the German states, in the Swiss towns, in Scandinavia, and they cross-hired like minor nobility of the shadows. An experienced headsman could be borrowed from another city for an execution that needed skill. An apprentice son might spend a year with a cousin in a neighboring town. Their letters must have been a mix of shop talk and quiet complaints. The sword needs a new edge. The council delayed payment again. The neighbors are staring. The baby is teething. Let's sink a little deeper into the domestic space. The house of an executioner was usually on the edge of things, near the city gate, outside the most respectable streets, sometimes literally beyond the walls. It made the commute easier, if we can say that without choking on the irony. The gallows stood outside the city as an example to travelers and a polite boundary. The messy stuff happens there. not here. From the house you could see fields. Geese wandered past. Children learned to keep away from the hooks and blades, and yet grew up so used to them that the tools looked like part of the furniture. A son might sand a sword handle as if he were polishing a spoon. A daughter might count the herb jars for her mother's healing trade, like any apothecary's child. They would learn, in that slow way children always learn, exactly how the town pretended not to see them. Because here is the paradox that hummed softly through their lives. The town needed them, and the town rejected them. So the executioner family did the only thing humans ever do in that situation. They created a small, durable pride. They did the job well. They kept notes. They trained skill. They told themselves and taught their children a simple moral. We handle what others cannot, so that the city may sleep at night. It's not a bad bedtime story. It's just an inconvenient one for your social calendar. Now, you might wonder about the famous hooded look, the theatrical acts, the sneer. It makes for good art and better masquerade costumes. But in reality, a competent executioner valued precision over drama. If he was a headsman, he trained his arm to cut cleanly, because a clean cut was kinder. If he was a hangman, he learned knots and trapdoor maths long before physics textbooks. If he supervised a breaking wheel, a grim, legal ritual designed for maximum publicity, he controlled the pace so the law was satisfied, not the crowd. The crowds, of course, would have preferred a show. Crowds always do. The executioner was there to deliver legal closure, not entertainment. Although on market days those lines did blur, let's float back to that second trade, healing. It wasn't just practical. It formed a social bridge. People would come at night or send a relative to ask for a salve for a burn or a poultice for a swollen joint. They would be grateful in private and disapproving in public. The executioner's wife often ran this side of the business. She kept the jars labeled and the patient conversations gentle. She heard local gossip in whispered doses. She traded herbs with midwives and borrowed tools from barber surgeons. And she collected payment in coins or favors, carefully recorded in a little book that could disappear if the church elders decided to frown too hard at unlicensed practitioners. The hypocrisy was not subtle, but people with pain are not picky. Children in these families grew up with a double curriculum: the "don't look at us" from the town and the "look closely" from home. They learned to read, sometimes better than their neighbors, because their fathers kept records and their mothers kept recipes. They learned to speak to authority without flinching, because councilmen liked steady eyes and steady hands. They learned to swallow insults and to make small, careful jokes. Humor as a coping tool is not new. It's as old as the first kid who tried to sit at a table and was told, "Not yet." That kid probably shrugged and said, "Fine, I prefer the bench anyway," and then never forgot. Apprenticeship was formalized in some towns. A son would accompany his father to punishments, not because anyone wanted him to, but because the craft required witnesses, assistants, and practice. He started with maintenance, cleaning, carrying, holding the horse. He learned timing, a concept that sat somewhere between law and theater. If you've ever watched a ritual and thought, "Why this exact order?" it's because the exact order kept people from improvising. Improvisation in public punishment led to mess and lawsuits. The last thing a council wanted was a crowd convinced that the executioner had mishandled a case and that the gods were now annoyed. In early modern Europe, gods got annoyed easily. By the time a son performed his first independent task, the faces in the crowd would be familiar. The baker who refused to sell to his mother. The neighbor who borrowed a ladder and never returned it. The hawker who made loud jokes in the tavern and went pale when an officer touched his shoulder. The executioner learned to see the crowd not as a moral jury, but as weather. Sometimes sunny, sometimes stormy, always changeable. He worked slowly, deliberately, and then went home. Marriage options remained narrow. Daughters of executioners married within the small circle of families accepted as appropriate. Sometimes that meant cousins by social proximity, if not blood. Sometimes it meant another outcast profession, a knacker who handled dead animals, a gravedigger who handled dead people after the executioner was done, a traveling butcher who knew knives and didn't ask many questions. Sons married daughters of the same closed world, and so the surnames repeated. If you read a town's registers like a lullaby, the same notes sound again and again. It kept the stigma in place. It also kept knowledge in place. You can call it a hereditary craft. You can also call it a generational problem the town declined to solve. The legal status of these families was at once privileged and precarious. Privileged because they had official roles, protections, and in some cases a decent house granted by the city. Precarious because every misstep was a scandal, and every scandal was a referendum on whether the town still needed them. They were exempt from some guild restrictions and included in others only on paper. They paid taxes, then petitioned for reductions, then sighed when the council said, "Next year, perhaps." The minutes of those meetings must have been thrilling in the bureaucratic sense. Lines and lines of small denials written in a careful hand by a clerk, who probably went home to a hot stew and never thought about the people under the last line he wrote that day. Let's drift to Paris, just for a moment, where the craft reached a kind of cold celebrity. A dynasty of executioners served the city for generations. The work grew elaborate with the arrival of that new, modern machine that promised equality in death by leveling technique, the guillotine. Scientific, people said, as if to soothe themselves. The families adjusted. A tool is a tool. The public learned a new rhythm of spectacle. The old craft, the swing of an arm, the calculus of rope, gave way to a lever. But the social stain remained, because progress is very good at changing machines and very bad at changing minds. The children of the executioner were still the children of the executioner. Schoolyard politics did not modernize. What did change, slowly, was the legal landscape. By the 18th and 19th centuries, courts reformed, punishments shifted, public executions reduced. The craft that had been stable for centuries started to wobble. Some families took on more healing, more butchery, more legitimate surgical work. Some simply faded. They married out when they could. They moved. They rebranded, to use a word that would have confused them and would have made a town clerk smile. Town clerks love a rebranded ledger entry. Look, the executioner's grandson is now a municipal servant. Lovely. Please file under M. It's tempting to romanticize them, to give them dramatic capes and tragic monologues. But the real texture is quiet, practical, and a little dull. which is exactly the point of tonight. The dullness is what makes it human. The daughter who learned to make a cough syrup that soothed half the neighborhood regardless of what they thought of her last name. The son who sanded the rough spot on the handle so it wouldn't blister his palm during a long day. The father who adjusted his schedule so he could watch his smallest child nap, just to remember what peace sounded like. Ordinary. You can map their days by small regularities. Monday, visit the council office to collect a delayed fee and pretend not to hear the clerk's muttered joke. Tuesday, repair the fence where the geese squeezed through. Wednesday, supervise a branding in the marketplace before noon and treat a stable boy's infected hand in the evening. Thursday, copy entries into the family record book. Friday, attend church but sit near the back with the other people who make everyone else uncomfortable but are necessary when things go wrong. Saturday, clean tools. Sunday, nap. If we slide back to Nuremberg, we find Franz Schmidt's diary, gently noting not just punishments, but absolutions. Criminals he deemed repentant. Executions he tried to perform with dignity. People he tried to heal. He retired, eventually, and even sought the legal erasure of his family's stain, a formal request to the authorities to recognize that he had served the city well, and that his children should not be punished socially for something the city required. Bureaucracy moved at its usual thrilling speed. And yet sometimes, the answer was yes. Small mercies do appear, very slowly, like a snail with a fresh stamp on its shell. Let's hover for a moment on tools again, because tools tell you how a craft thinks. The sword was kept in a case of soft leather, oiled so it wouldn't rust. The rope was coiled carefully after use, not out of tenderness, but because sloppy rope is dangerous rope. The branding irons were heated evenly, not to cause more pain, but to avoid messy scars that caused infections, which caused talk, which caused complaints, which caused council meetings, which everyone hated. The wheel needed maintenance like a cart. No one wanted a creak at the wrong moment. Silence was part of the ritual. Not the silence of awe, the silence of paperwork done correctly. Household books show seasonal buying, winter fuel, extra cloth for children who grew too fast, a new jar for honey salve, a present for a wife who held the household together without applause. Men get their names in city ledgers, but it's often the wives who made the math work. A wife could talk to someone who wouldn't talk to her husband. She could trade herbs for eggs, bread for beeswax, a night visit for a promise to keep certain gossip gentle. If anyone in the family performed social alchemy, it was usually her. Over the centuries, stories piled up. Little legends stuck to the real people like burrs on a cloak. The hand of glory, the hooded figure, the brooding castle tower. Most of it is theater added later by people who would never survive a week of the job's tedium. The truth is softer. It's a man at a table, closing his eyes between ink lines. It's a woman closing a door quietly after a patient leaves, then wiping the table with vinegar. It's a child tracing letter forms while listening to adults talk in the low tones of people who have learned not to disturb the neighbors. As we drift toward the end of this first part, keep a small image in mind. A narrow lane on the edge of a walled town. The grass beyond it is simple and a little damp. A house leans into the wind. Smoke goes up from a chimney that never draws quite well enough. Inside, a woman checks her herb jars. A man polishes a blade in slow circles, not because he loves it, but because it's Tuesday, and that's what you do. A child watches the door and listens for footsteps, not in fear, in habit. The world has taught this family to watch. They do. They always have. And still, somehow, they sleep. We'll continue by gliding slowly into specific families whose names became labels for a profession, and then, inconveniently for them, folk legends for everyone else. We'll meet the ones who tried to leave the trade and the ones who kept it with professional pride. For now, let the edges of the town blur. Let the ledgers close. The hearthwood settles with a small crack. That's just the house agreeing with gravity. Welcome back. Settle your shoulders. Loosen your jaw. Let the room go dim around the edges. We're going to stay in this half-lit lane a little longer and look at the lineages that made execution not just a job, but a surname you could recognize from a mile away. It's not glamorous. It's not dreadful in the theatrical sense. It's administrative fate turned into family history, which is about as sleepy as history gets, and therefore perfect for tonight. Let's ease in where we already left a bookmark. The headsman who kept a diary, the kind of man who would label a drawer string, assorted, and sleep better for it. He embodied something you see again and again with these families. They were repositories of method. Everything they did had to be reproducible. Not for art, for liability. If you ever want to picture the inner life of a professional executioner, imagine a craftsman who hated surprises. Surprises led to noise. Noise led to petitions. Petitions led to councils. And councils meant long afternoons standing near a door while a clerk looked bored and tried to remember your name without saying it out loud. Now, dynasties formed, sometimes by design, sometimes by inertia. A father trained a son because who else would take him? A daughter married a cousin in the trade because who else would accept her? And once you had two generations, a third felt inevitable, like moss on a stone fountain. The water keeps flowing. The green slowly expands. No one writes a law. Everyone understands the arrangement. Across regions, the job title changed, but the familial pattern didn't. In German lands, the Scharfrichter, literally the sharp judge. In French cities, the executeur des hautes-œuvres, the executor of high works, which sounds like he's preparing an art installation. In Italian towns, the boia, a word that became an insult on its own because, of course it did. Whatever you called him, he anchored a small social island, and on that island were children who learned how to move their bodies through markets like the wind through a doorway. Present, necessary, easily resented. I want you to picture a dinner. It's early winter. The light slips off the street much too soon. A family sits at a heavy table that has seen 1,000 careful meals. No one drinks heavily. That would be unprofessional. A blade sits in a leather case against the wall, not because anyone is showing off, but because there aren't many good places to store a long object safely in a small house. The youngest child asks a question with no clean answer. Some fathers tried to buy a different path for their children. Education was a lever. There are entries in town records where an executioner petitions for his son to be accepted into a guild or a university, arguing that good service merits a normal life. Sometimes the council said yes, perhaps because a member had a toothache and the salve worked, or because the ledger showed the man had not troubled them for years. Other times, the answer was a soft no wrapped in polite words. We will consider it at the next session. Anyone who has dealt with a committee recognizes that tone. The next session appears at the speed of winter sunrises. Let's drift into the odd mix of privilege and ban that marked their civic status. In some cities, the executioner was the only person legally allowed to touch things considered unclean by statute. The gallows, confiscated property, certain tools of punishment, even taboo animals. That monopoly gave him little pockets of authority. If the city wanted the gallows repaired, he hired the carpenters and watched them work. If contraband needed burning, he supervised the fire. If a traveling show wanted to perform a spectacle that brushed up against punishment, a mock beheading for laughs, a trick rope routine, he had the right to say no. Small powers, to be sure, but they taught his children that the word no could belong to them in rare and specific circumstances. That's a lesson with a surprisingly calming effect. A boundary, however narrow, is still a boundary. Their houses contained other quiet borders. Some rooms were a family's private domestic space. Others were half clinic, half workshop, blending the healing side of the trade with the maintenance of tools. A shelf of herbs alongside a whetstone. A wooden chair that was equally good for removing a splinter and discussing council orders. Bottles labeled in cramped handwriting. A rope coiled like a sleeping cat in a corner you learned, as a child, to walk around without being told. Children didn't need lectures. The architecture taught them. And then there were the weekly rituals. Market day meant surveillance, not the sinister police kind, the practical, what is the mood of the town kind. The executioner's wife learned to read the stallholders' faces the way some people read the weather from the smell of rain. That butcher is nervous. Someone's cousin is in trouble. That glover is too cheerful. He got a new contract. The gossip line, which always ran through women's talk in doorways and over bread baskets, gave the family early warning of trouble. If a punishment was coming, better to know 2 days early. It meant sharpening today instead of tomorrow. It meant convincing a teenage son to come home early from the river, because tomorrow will be long and his father needs him rested. The tone of that caution never carried drama. It sounded like planning for laundry around a storm. We should glide for a moment toward the health work again, because it knitted these families into the town with the thinnest but most resilient thread. People remember who helps them when official channels shrug. The executioner's salves were not miracles. They were incremental. Reduce swelling, keep a wound clean, reset a finger so it grows straight enough to grip a plow. These acts sat in the category of boringly essential. That category is why societies function. It is also why the people in it rarely get statues. Statues are for generals. Ointments are for Tuesday. There were, of course, small moments of social comedy. Imagine the festival season. The city tries to look cheerful. A few rude songs circulate because rude songs always circulate. A mask maker suggests a hooded figure as a costume. A councilman pretends not to notice. The executioner quietly takes his family out the side gate that day and walks a loop around the fields instead. Wildflowers make fewer comments, and still, recognition crept in at odd moments. There's a certain stony respect given to people who do what others avoid. You see it in the small ways. A door held open, a nod from a soldier who knows something about duty, a priest who chooses not to move the family to the back pew again because he's tired and this isn't the hill he wants to die on, metaphorically. Incremental decencies, the kinds that don't make it into official minutes, but make it easier to breathe in a crowded room. If you're wondering about the training itself, the pedagogy was tactile, no theory without muscle memory. The son learned how to assess the weight and balance of a blade with his eyes closed. He learned to coil rope until his fingers could do it in darkness. He learned to measure a drop by counting heartbeats because not every scaffold had an identical height and not every beam carried weight the same way. A father might demonstrate on a sack of sand. He might mark lengths with chalk on a wall. He might mutter rules that sound like small spells. This many inches for a man this heavy. This knot here, not there. This lever slow, never fast. None of it mystical. All of it strangely intimate, like teaching a child to knead bread. Daughters trained too, in the parallel craft of household triage. If the father's work was to perform visible justice competently, the mother's work was to perform continuous mercy quietly. She taught her girls when to open the door at night and when to keep it shut, how to label a jar so even a sleepy hand finds the right leaf, which neighbor could be trusted with a secret, and which neighbor was a sieve. She coached them in the art of polite non-answers. How is your husband's work? Steady. Busy? Steady. The same answer covers all seasons. The daughters learned to tidy a room so it looked like nothing had ever happened there, which is a good metaphor for how most societies cope with the people they need but don't want to see. Let's let our thoughts wander down the road to another city where a long-serving executioner became a minor local figure. He walked with the slightly careful gait of a man who knows people are always watching his hands. He signed for deliveries with a neat, almost beautiful signature. He maintained a little garden because gardens don't gossip. He had a favorite chair with one leg slightly shorter than the others, which he fixed with a sliver of leather he cut from a scrap meant for a scabbard. Practicality is a personality type. He wore it like a quiet uniform. His children absorbed the pace. They were not feral creatures of rumor. They were tidy. That tends to surprise people who prefer their legends blurry and their real people messy. Tidy children from stained families confuse the moral compass that likes to spin dramatically. But the executioner's household relied on order. Disorder elsewhere could be endured, not at home. If the outside world insisted on mixing disgust with dependence, the house could at least be a place where the bottom of the drawer always held the thimble, and the second shelf always held the vinegar, and the back step always had a broom leaning at a precise angle that said, "We are us." On holy days, they tried to participate without insisting on the front row. There is a way to be present that registers as respectful without being visible. The children learned it. The parents perfected it. On civic days, where punishments coincided with pageantry, they performed their roles with a studied blankness that didn't tempt the crowd into theatrics. They were professionals, surrounded by amateurs of outrage. You can feel the difference in the air. It's cooler. It moves slower. It does not respond to the shout of a boy who wants to impress his friends. It responds only to the nod of a magistrate who wants to go home on time. If we zoom out, you can see the craft's quiet standardization over centuries. Tools became more regulated, fees more fixed, procedures more written. That shift did what bureaucratic shifts always do. It protected the city more than it protected the practitioner. But within those constraints, the families carved out modest safety. Predictability is its own blanket. When you know what a week looks like, you can plan the stew. There were moments, rare but real, when an executioner's household did something so obviously helpful that even the sharpest tongues had to rest. A plague season, for instance, when the family's knowledge of disinfectants and of how to move around sickness without inviting it made them valuable. They knew how to burn things properly. They knew how to avoid touching their faces. They knew how to keep a room aired, even in winter. People remembered who knocked on a door with a small bundle of herbs and said, "This helps the cough." Gratitude was not permanent, but it had a half-life longer than mockery. And then time, as it insists on doing, moved. Laws reformed. Spectacle shrank. Some cities eliminated public execution entirely or pushed it into secluded corners. You might think that solved the family's problem. It did not. Stigma's inertia is powerful. You can remove the scaffold from the square faster than you can remove a label from a surname. So the grandchildren of the craft found themselves in a weird social valley. Less work, same name. Do you move? Do you change your spelling and hope the clerk misses the lineage? Some did. A stroke of a pen can be both trivial and life-changing. Others leaned into the healing trade and became, in everything but paperwork, what they had been at night for generations. Unlicensed, competent clinicians who knew the human body better than most polite people like to admit. There are quiet success stories buried in town books. An executioner's grandson admitted to a guild as a low-level craftsman. A granddaughter married to a respectable tradesman in another city, where her last name meant nothing to anyone. A son who learned enough Latin to impress a priest who wrote a letter which opened a door. These are not cinematic victories. They are the victories of people who persist. If you're looking for inspiration, it's cozy and minor. But minor improvements are how most lives become bearable. It helps, too, to remember that not all towns were identical. Some were stern and sticky with custom. Others were looser, more mercantile, and therefore more forgiving. Money can lubricate social gears. A city with trade on its mind sometimes looks at a useful family and thinks, quietly, let them be. And let them be is more radical than it sounds. Replace the fantasy of society's sudden acceptance with the reality of society's intermittent neglect. Neglect, when it's benign, is peace. Let's come back to the house, because that's where the texture lives. An afternoon after rain. The yard smells of wet dust. A mother hangs shirts and watches the street. A father rubs the edge of a blade and stops when his thumb tells him it's right. The older child copies a recipe for tincture of something that begins with an S and has too many consonants, because plants in Germanic languages often sound like mild threats. The younger child naps with their mouth open in a way that would mortify them later. The kettle ticks. A footstep outside pauses, then passes on. This is what normal felt like when your normal had to be built by hand. In that normal, dignity wasn't a speech. It was a set of habits. Show up on time. Don't talk more than you need to. Don't drink before work. Pay your taxes even if the clerk rolls his eyes. Keep your records legible. Label the jars. Lock the door gently. These may sound small. They are small. but they accrete into a life that can survive scrutiny and indifference with equal grace. If you want a symbol to hold, imagine the family's keyring, heavy for the size. A key for the outer door. A key for a cabinet no child opens. A key for a small chest with coin and papers. Maybe, depending on the city, a key that belongs to the town itself, entrusted to the head of the household for specific occasions. The kind of key that doesn't feel like power so much as responsibility welded into metal. That ring clinks softly when it's set on the table. It's a sound the children associate with safety. The person with keys is home. You can also picture a shelf of books. Not many. Books cost. But a Bible, obviously. A devotional or two. And then the practical volumes. A medical handbook passed from a barber surgeon who owed a favor. A legal primer with dog-eared pages on municipal penalties. A notebook of measurements and notes written by the father's hand, inherited from his father, and rewritten by the son because copying is how you prove to yourself that you understand. The writing is small and firm. No flourishes. Flourishes are for people trying to be noticed. These families cultivated the opposite skill. Sometimes a neighbor would ask a question on behalf of a friend. The friend had a boil that wouldn't go. The friend had a sprain that wouldn't fade. The executioner's wife would receive the message with a calm face and say the friend is welcome after dusk. And the person would come, relieved and a little ashamed. And they would sit, and they would be stitched or salved or advised to avoid certain foods for a while. They would pay if they could. If not, they would send eggs tomorrow. And the next day, they might nod at the family from across the street, courage bolstered by gratitude, until it faded, as it always did, replaced by the old posture of looking past. We can drift, too, into the mathematics of reputation. One public mishap could undo 10 quiet kindnesses. That was the risk profile of the trade. So the head of the household lived with a carefulness that might read as cold. It wasn't cold. It was defensive. He kept his voice level. He picked his words like stones in a shallow river, testing each before placing weight. He apologized when the ritual required it, which is a skill some magistrates never learned. He said thank you to the clerk, even when the clerk was the least helpful human in a 10-mile radius. He understood that institutional memory favors mistakes, so he tried not to give it any. Over time, you can see the arc of these families' social weather clearing a little, like mist thinning on a field. Not because hearts changed, because life moved on. New scandals arrived. New bureaucracies swallowed old ones. A surname that once made a tavern go quiet became the surname of a man who sold shoes, or a woman who sold soap in a different town where the clerk didn't have that memory. The edges softened. The children grew, married, had children with different last names, and in 3 generations, the line looked like a normal colony of people who camp where work is. What lingers, though, is the idea that whole lives can be organized around work other people dislike. It's not a lesson we rush to embrace. We want history to be about thunderclaps. This part of history is about the low hum of a mill wheel that turns so steadily you don't hear it until it stops. They kept the mechanism oiled. They took the heat when it squeaked. They measured the grain, weighed the sacks, and went home with flour in their hair and the faint hope that tomorrow someone might look them in the eye without the little flinch. Sometimes someone did. Before we pause, take one more soft image with you. A late evening. The town quiet. A window lit by a small flame. Inside, two figures moving slowly, performing the routine of closing a day, capping a jar, sliding a blade into leather, adding a line to a notebook, dousing the lamp. The door latch settles. The keys clink. The house exhales. And in that ordinary sound is everything these families wanted from a world that asked strange things of them: privacy, continuity, and a night of unbroken sleep.